Hey there, sleepless rabble. Lean back, let me take over for a while. Tonight, we're descending into the Jared Leto Iceberg. On the surface, he's Hollywood's favorite chameleon, Oscar winning actor, rock star with stadiums chanting his lyrics, Gucci's personal messiah model. But dig a little deeper and things get strange. We're talking cult retreats on Croatian islands, fans in white robes, lawsuits dressed up as holy wars, and allegations dark enough to freeze anyone's blood. Unless, of course, you're Jared Leto. This isn't just a celebrity story, it's a whole descent. From glossy beginnings to obsessive fandom, from the Echelon's devotion to Mars Island's price tag, from whispers online to testimonies in print. By the end, you'll see why people call him Gucci Jesus, and why others call him something far less flattering. And now, hand on heart. My mum admitted she had a Jared Leto crush as a teenager. Me? Couldn't care less. But what about you? Did you ever swoon over him? Or did you always think this clown was a walking red flag? Drop it in the comments. Like this video if you're ready to dive under the surface. Subscribe so you don't miss the next iceberg. This is Napmax Sleep Stories. And you're listening to the Jared Leto Iceberg Explained for Sleep. Now, let's start at the surface. Every so-called cult leader starts out looking pretty harmless. And Jared Leto? He began life in one of the least messianic places imaginable. Bossier City, Louisiana. Not exactly the cradle of art and genius, more the kind of town where the highlight of the week is Walmart stocking a new brand of chips. But if you squint hard enough, you can say growing up there gave him an early lesson in escape artistry. You either get out, or you get stuck. Jared naturally was already plotting his escape route. His childhood wasn't the sort that breeds accountants. Raised by a free-spirited mother, a self-styled hippie who believed art and alternative living were better than steady jobs and PTA meetings, Jared grew up in a haze of music, paints, and eccentric philosophies. Sounds cool on paper until you realize that's code for chaotic as hell. Still, out of that chaos came the idea that he wasn't meant to blend in. He was meant to shine, even if it meant shining in ways that made other people roll their eyes. By the early 90s, he drifted westward, chasing that neon mirage called Hollywood. And somehow, he landed a role that would define his early aura. Jordan Catalano in My So-Called Life. Yes. The sullen boy with perfect hair who leaned against lockers with the dramatic weight of a Shakespearean tragedy. Claire Danes cried, teenage hearts fluttered, and Jared hardly had to say more than 3 lines an episode. The brooding gaze did all the work. It was enough to make him a teen idol, plastered across bedroom walls, filed under Dream Boyfriend, right next to Leonardo DiCaprio. But Jordan Catalano was also the first hint of a pattern. Jared didn't have to try that hard to make people project onto him. Fans filled in the blanks. A blank stare became mystery. A late answer became depth. It was charisma by suggestion. And it worked like a charm. Hollywood noticed too. Soon he popped up in films like Fight Club, as the pretty boy who got his face rearranged by Edward Norton, and then Requiem for a Dream. That one was his coronation. Leto starved himself rail thin, lost his boyish glow, and gave critics what they adore most, a beautiful man suffering for art. He was suddenly serious. He was suddenly committed. In other words, Hollywood handed him the golden ticket. But Jared wasn't content with just acting. By the mid-2000s, he decided the world needed him as a rock star too. Enter 30 Seconds to Mars, the band he formed with his brother Shannon. At first, it was easy to dismiss as another vanity project. Actors with guitars usually go down like bad karaoke. But Leto did it differently. He poured not just songs, but identity into it. The eyeliner, the grandiose album art, the cryptic symbols. He didn't want a band, he wanted a movement, and the fans bought in. At concerts, people weren't just singing along, they were worshipping. Tattoos of the band's glyphs spread like secret society emblems. Online forums buzzed with coded language, as though 30 Seconds to Mars wasn't just music, but revelation. On the surface, everything sparkled. The actor-rock star hybrid, adored in Hollywood, worshipped in stadiums, and photographed draped in designer robes like he'd just descended from a Renaissance fresco. But every iceberg looks harmless at the tip. And if you tilted your head just right, you could already see the cracks forming. The obsession with his image, the strange, almost religious fervour in his fans, the gnawing suspicion that this wasn't going to end with just Oscars and platinum records. Because beneath the polished surface, something was brewing, and its name was Echelon. Every band has fans. Jared Leto had believers. When 30 Seconds to Mars first hit the scene, it looked like your standard early 2000s alt-rock experiment. Eyeliner, big choruses, a dash of sci-fi branding. The kind of thing you'd expect to open for Linkin Park, not rewrite the rulebook on fan devotion. But then came the Echelon. Officially, the Echelon was just the band's fan club. Nothing unusual. Every band needs a street team to push tickets and argue on message boards about which album is the real masterpiece. But the Echelon wasn't like that. It wasn't just a mailing list or a forum, it was a lifestyle. Fans called themselves the Echelon. They didn't just like the music, they identified with it, as though Jared's songs were scripture and every tattooed glyph a holy mark. Symbols became central, arrows, circles, cryptic numbers. If you stumbled into one of their forums back in the day, it felt less like talking about a band, and more like entering a digital lodge of a secret society. They shared codes, insider language, elaborate theories about what it all really meant. Spoiler. It didn't mean much, but mystery is addictive. Jared understood that better than anyone. He never explained too much, and fans filled the silence with devotion. Soon the line between band and fan blurred. Leto encouraged interaction, but not in the see you at the merch booth way. He cultivated it. You weren't just listening to his music. You were part of something larger. Part of the war. Ah, yes. The war. In 2008, 30 Seconds to Mars got slapped with a $30 million lawsuit by their label EMI for allegedly breaking their contract. Most bands would have handled it quietly in boardrooms with lawyers. Not Jared. He framed it like an epic crusade. David versus Goliath, Mars versus the industry machine. And the Echelon? They were drafted. Fans weren't just fans anymore. They were soldiers. Defending Jared became a mission, a badge of honor, a sacred duty. The following year, the band released This Is War, an album that turned the whole saga into art. It wasn't just music, it was manifesto. The cover art? Thousands of individual fan photos, each a face in the army. The chorus of voices? Literally recorded from fans chanting. The message? We are one. We are family. We are legion. It was brilliant marketing, but it also blurred reality in dangerous ways. You weren't just buying a CD, you were pledging allegiance. At shows, the atmosphere was less concert and more revival meeting. Fans waving flags, chanting symbols, screaming Jared's name with the same intensity monks scream, gods, tattoos multiplied. Lyrics became life mottos, and online, the Echelon treated criticism of Jared like heresy. To question him was to invite exile. The thing about cults is, they rarely announce themselves. They start small, disguised as community, a sense of belonging. And the Echelon was exactly that: an escape, a family, a purpose. But families don't usually have logos, coded alphabets, and members who'd happily mortgage their future for a backstage pass. And the deeper fans fell, the more Jared leaned in. He'd crafted not just an audience, but a devoted flock. And with every cryptic interview, every theatrical silence, he nudged them closer to treating him not as a rock star, but as something more. Up top, it looked like fandom. Down below, it was starting to look suspiciously like faith. Every band claims to have the best fans in the world. But not every band ends up with a fan base that behaves like a secret society armed with triangles, cryptic numbers, and the kind of devotion that makes your average church choir look like casuals. By the time This Is War dropped in 2009, Jared Leto wasn't just leading a band. He was leading something closer to a movement. Or at least that's what it felt like if you were standing in the middle of an arena with thousands of people screaming his lyrics like scripture. The EMI lawsuit a year earlier had been the perfect crucible. 30 Seconds to Mars facing down a $30 million lawsuit. To most musicians, that's a crisis. To Jared, it was branding gold. He spun it into a story of underdogs versus the corporate machine. A holy war, staged not in courts, but in the hearts of his fans. They weren't just concert goers anymore, they were soldiers, and the Echelon ate it up. Then came the album itself. This Is War wasn't marketed like music. It was marketed like a manifesto. The cover art, thousands of tiny fan portraits assembled into one enormous mosaic, turned listening into belonging. Every track thundered with martial drums, massed voices, and anthemic refrains big enough to shake a stadium roof. And some of those voices, they belonged to the fans themselves, literally layered into the songs. Imagine hearing your own echo inside a war chant. It's not just music, it's indoctrination with reverb. The live shows leaned all the way in. When the lights cut, the crowd didn't just cheer, they roared like a congregation spotting their prophet. Jared knew how to work the silence. Stand still for 10 seconds, lift his arms ever so slightly, and the place would erupt like he just raised the dead. Fans weren't just waving hands anymore. They were holding up flags with band sigils, chanting phrases that sounded one part Latin Mass, one part dystopian sci-fi rally. And the tattoos. Always the tattoos. Fans carved the band's glyphs into their skin with the kind of permanence usually reserved for wedding vows. Circles, arrows, abstract marks that didn't mean much outside the Echelon. But inside, they were like passports. You could show up in a city where you knew no one, flash the triangle on your wrist, and instantly you weren't alone. A family of strangers would buy you drinks, share stories, call you brother or sister. Not bad for the price of a few needle pricks. Online, things spiraled further. Message boards and fan sites stopped sounding like music chatter and started reading like scripture study groups. What do the symbols really mean? What's hidden in the lyrics? Why does Jared pause at that exact lyric on stage? Every crumb became a code, every silence a clue. Jared, for his part, never explained. That was the trick. He knew mystery multiplies devotion. He could smile, dodge a question, drop a cryptic phrase, and the forms would be decoding it for months. And let's not ignore the cash flow. Meet and greets weren't sold as extras. They were marketed like spiritual upgrades. Pay more, stand closer, pay even more, and maybe Jared would glance at you for 3 seconds, which you could then recount on Tumblr like a divine visitation. Bands usually sell posters. Jared sold nearness, and nearness, in a structure that already feels like a cult, is the highest currency there is. By 2012, the Echelon wasn't just a fandom. It was an identity. People didn't say, I like 30 Seconds to Mars. They said, I am Echelon. That's not marketing. That's liturgy. And it worked terrifyingly well. From the outside, it all looked like overzealous rock fans doing what rock fans do. But if you watch closely, the line between fandom and faith was thinning. The band wasn't just giving people songs, it was giving them a compass, a cause, a family. And when those three things fuse under one leader's hand, you don't get a fan club. You get a congregation waiting for the next sermon. And Jared, well, he had no intention of keeping it in the arenas. Most bands hit legal trouble and go quiet. 30 Seconds to Mars turned theirs into a crusade. In 2008, EMI slapped Jared and his brother Shannon with a $30 million lawsuit for allegedly breaking their contract. That's the kind of number that makes most musicians curl up in the fetal position and sell their gear on Craigslist. Jared? He called it destiny. Suddenly, interviews weren't about the music. They were about freedom and artistic integrity. The label wasn't just a business partner anymore, it was the empire. And Jared positioned himself as Luke Skywalker, Che Guevara, and Jesus Christ, all rolled into one very expensive leather jacket. He didn't just tell the Echelon he was fighting for them, he told them they were the fight. And they believed him. Enter This Is War. An album named like a headline, marketed like a manifesto, and swallowed whole by fans who were ready to march into battle with triangles on their wrists. The cover? A patchwork of thousands of fan portraits. Not so much artwork as a congregation portrait. The songs? Bombastic. Swelling with choirs that weren't choirs at all, but recordings of the fans themselves. It wasn't enough to buy the record. You had to be the record. And that was the genius. The lawsuit became the myth. The myth became the war. And the war became a product you could order in 3 different deluxe editions. The whole thing blurred beautifully into a kind of participatory propaganda. Every CD you bought, every photo you uploaded, every tattoo you inked into your skin wasn't just fandom, it was proof you were enlisted. The live shows during this era looked like somebody had snuck a revival meeting into an arena. Jared stalked the stage with arms raised like he was about to part the Red Sea, and the crowd responded like disciples desperate for a miracle. Flags with the band's glyphs waved overhead like holy banners. When he whispered, thousands hushed. When he screamed, the floor shook. You could almost forget it was supposed to be a concert and not the launch of a breakaway religion. Meanwhile, the lawsuit settled, of course. The big, scary $30 million monster reduced to paperwork and handshakes, like most industry disputes. But did Jared tell it that way? Absolutely not. In the Echelon narrative, the band had slain a dragon, toppled the industry, rewritten history. It was David versus Goliath, and David happened to look really good in eyeliner. The irony. The so-called war against the music industry didn't dismantle the system at all. It made Jared a master of it. He didn't burn down the machine, he figured out how to charge admission to watch him fight it. Fans lined up for meet and greets, priced like small vacations, bought merch like relics, and screamed themselves hoarse defending him online as though the fate of humanity depended on it. For the casual observer, it was rock and roll theatre. For the Echelon, it was scripture set to power chords. They weren't just following a band anymore. They were following a messiah who'd proven he could stand against the giants and win. And when a crowd believes their leader can topple empires, it's only a matter of time before he decides to build his own. Every religion eventually needs a holy site. Catholics had the Vatican, Muslims had Mecca, the Grateful Dead had parking lots, and Jared Leto, he chose a Croatian island with better lighting than God himself ever commissioned. Mars Island was sold not as a concert, but as an experience. Fans weren't just buying tickets, they were buying transcendence. At a starting price that could also get you a week in Santorini with cocktails, room service, and a pool boy named Nikos. But who wants a pool boy when you can get a personal glimpse of Jared in a white robe, barefoot, smiling like he personally invented serotonin? The imagery was instant internet gold. Those photos of Jared, hair flowing, arms outstretched in the sun, with hundreds of fans dressed in identical white robes, gazing at him like a walking vision board. They looked less like a rock festival and more like stills from a Netflix cult docuseries. Journalists didn't even have to try. Is this a band retreat or a cult? Wrote itself. The itinerary didn't help either. Sunrise yoga sessions, naturally branded Mars Yoga, because why just stretch your hamstrings when you can align your chakras under the benevolent gaze of your rock star? Vegan communal meals, acoustic campfire sets, intimate Q&A sessions where you got to ask Jared vague spiritual questions that he'd answer with cryptic riddles. It wasn't a meet and greet. It was a pilgrimage disguised as a wellness retreat, wrapped in a luxury festival bow. And the dress code, the dress code. White clothing encouraged, which, let's be honest, was less beach chic and more mandatory cult cosplay. Anyone who's ever been to a wedding knows what happens when you ask a group of people to wear the same color. Suddenly, you're part of a ritual, whether you like it or not. Seeing hundreds of people in white moving in unison across the sand wasn't just creepy. It was effective. Uniforms work. Always have. And Jared, gliding through them in his own pristine robes, knew exactly how powerful the image would be. For the fans, though, it wasn't sinister. It was sacred. People described the island as life-changing. They didn't just fly home with merch bags. They flew home with glowing testimonials that wouldn't sound out of place in a cult exit interview. I felt seen. It changed how I look at the world. Jared touched my hand, and I cried for 3 hours. If that sounds exaggerated, well, that's the point. Once you've been through a ritual, it's almost impossible to admit it might have just been overpriced tourism with a side of eyeliner. Critics had a field day. Memes spread, headlines screamed, Jared Leto cult, think pieces compared it to NixVM, Jonestown, and Burning Man with better Wi-Fi. But Jared? He didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned right into it. At one point, he literally tweeted, "Yes, this is a cult. 3 words, capital letters, no shame." The kind of thing a PR manager would usually faint over. But Jared, he knew better. If you call yourself a cult before anyone else does, you own the joke. And when you own the joke, you control the narrative. Besides, ridicule is just free advertising. Every article mocking Mars Island only made it more mysterious to those already invested. Outsiders roll their eyes. Insiders double down. That's how cult dynamics work. The more you're mocked, the more convinced you are that you're onto something bigger than them. And Jared, smiling behind his sunglasses, understood that perfectly. But let's be real. For all the mystique, Mars Island was also a brilliant business move. When you strip away the robes and bonfires, what you've got is a high-margin holiday package with a Messiah-shaped cherry on top. Pay thousands, spend a few days on a beach, go home with a tan, and a story about staring into Jared's eyes. Some call it spiritual transformation. Others call it exploitation with sea view catering. Tomato, tomato. The irony? Jared wasn't hiding it. He was selling the illusion of closeness, and fans were lining up, wallets open, begging for more. What was once a concert ticket had mutated into a sacrament. And the thing about sacraments is, they never come cheap. So yes, from the outside, Mars Island looked absurd. A sun-soaked cosplay of religion, complete with robes, rituals, and a very convenient price list. But for those who went, it was unforgettable. And unforgettable is the currency that keeps you coming back. Because once you've been on the island, eaten at the communal table, sung by firelight while Jared strummed like a barefoot prophet, how do you go back to being just another fan in the cheap seats of an arena? You don't. You chase the next high. You save up for the next retreat. You sell your soul for another glimpse of the man in white. And that, dear sleepless rabble, is when the vacation becomes a business model. The thing about religion, whether it's medieval Christianity, modern megachurches, or Jared Leto's Adriatic cosplay, is that it's never just about belief. It's about access. Access to the divine, access to the sacred, access to the man in white, who looks like he could bless your chakras with a side glance. And access, conveniently, is always tiered. Mars Island wasn't sold like a rock festival, it was packaged like a luxury retreat. Tier 1, the basic experience. If you call dropping a couple $1,000 basic, you'd get your communal meals, your yoga sessions, your nightly sing-alongs under the stars. Tier 2, enhanced closeness. A photo with Jared, maybe a handshake, maybe 30 seconds where he pretended to remember your name. Tier 3, the full enlightenment. Premium lodging, premium access, the ability to breathe his air at closer range than the unwashed Echelon masses. And if you had the cash, there was always a higher tier waiting. The sacred always has a surcharge. Fans didn't see it as a transaction, of course. They saw it as an investment. You weren't paying for a package. You were buying a story you could tell for the rest of your life. I was there, I sat in circle, I sang with him. Suddenly that blurry selfie with Jared became a relic. Proof that you'd touched something divine. In the Middle Ages, people paid for splinters of the true cross. In the 2010s, they paid for 3 seconds of direct eye contact with Jared Leto on a beach. Progress, right? The genius, or the scam, depending on how charitable you feel, was how the whole setup blurred money and meaning. Most bands have VIP tickets. Jared turned VIP into pilgrimage. Most bands sell t-shirts. Jared sold belonging. And once you equate proximity with transcendence, the price tag doesn't matter anymore. The only question becomes, how much is your faith worth? And oh, the testimonies. People left the island sounding like they'd survived a miracle cure. It changed my life. I felt healed. He spoke to me. And I swear I'll never be the same. That's the language of worship. That's also the language of multi-level marketing. It's all the same cycle. Pay, participate, feel special, recruit your friends, repeat. Only this time, instead of vitamins or essential oils, you were buying access to Jared's aura. Meanwhile, the press wasn't fooled. They called it exploitation. They called it absurd. Photos of Jared in flowing white surrounded by his flock got memed to death. But memes don't hurt business. They advertise it. Every "is this a cult?" headline doubled as free marketing. And the Echelon? They didn't care if the outside world laughed. If anything, it made them feel more chosen. Outsiders always mock what they don't understand. That's part of the ritual. Ridicule from the uninitiated. validation from the flock. And Jared, of course, played it perfectly. Yes, this is a cult, he once tweeted, leaning into the absurdity like it was performance art. Smart move. Once you say it yourself, no one else can use it against you. It's the oldest trick in the book. Laugh at yourself, and suddenly you're untouchable. Meanwhile, the tickets sell out faster every year. But here's the darker truth. Cults don't just run on belief, they run on sacrifice. In this case, financial sacrifice. People emptied savings accounts to go, maxed credit cards, lied to partners about the price of a holiday. That's when devotion crosses into dependency. When your bank balance takes the hit, but your brain convinces you it was worth every penny because how else would you explain the hole in your wallet? And once you've paid that much, you're locked in. You can't admit it was a rip-off. You have to double down. You have to believe it was transcendent, because the alternative is facing the bill. That's the psychology Jared was banking on, whether he'd admit it or not. So was Mars Island a scam? A cult? A luxury fan convention with better lighting? Honestly, all three. But what mattered wasn't the label. What mattered was that Jared had perfected the art of selling nearness, and as long as nearness felt like divinity, there would always be someone willing to pay. And while the Echelon were busy writing breathless blog posts about how Jared's smile cured their existential dread, rumours were already circulating. Whispers of things far less Instagrammable. Stories that weren't about yoga or sunsets, but about girls too young, fans too vulnerable, boundaries too easily crossed. Because money buys loyalty, but power buys silence. Every cult story has two versions. The one you see in the glossy brochure, and the one whispered in corners once the music fades. Jared Leto's story is no different. On the surface, there were the robes, the sunsets, the war chants echoing across arenas. Beneath, there were murmurs, ugly, persistent, the kind of rumors you can't quite laugh off, no matter how many Gucci capes you drape yourself in. The whispers started years back, in the shadowy underbelly of forums and gossip blogs. Stories of Jared hitting on girls far younger than he should, of parties where boundaries blurred, of fans who thought they were chosen, only to realize they'd been played. In the beginning, it was easy to dismiss. Rock stars have always been magnets for rumor, and the internet runs on exaggeration. But then, the stories multiplied. Patterns emerged. And suddenly the cult jokes didn't feel so funny anymore. Some women spoke of being contacted when they were still teenagers. A casual DM. A late night phone call. Invitations that sounded flattering at first, until they weren't. The word grooming began to stick, whispered with the weight of experience. One TikTok went viral. A young woman describing how Jared had pursued her at 17, only to consummate the connection once she turned 18, as if legality were just another costume change. She called it disturbing, others called it a pattern. Then came the airmail expose, the one that finally forced the whispers into daylight. 9 women stepping forward with stories that painted a chillingly consistent picture. Jared's behavior was predatory, terrifying, and unacceptable. Some described him making sexual advances when they were underage. Others remembered phone calls laced with sexual overtones, nights where he crossed lines no one had consented to. One recalled him masturbating in front of her without warning. Another remembered feeling cornered, reduced to an object in a game he alone controlled. These weren't the usual messy anecdotes of rock and roll excess. They were accounts of exploitation, the kind that leaves scars. And of course, Jared denied it all. His team pushed back, issuing the standard Hollywood denial script. Baseless, false, categorically untrue. But denials don't erase testimony. They don't erase the tremor in someone's voice when they say, I was there, I remember, it happened. The media feasted. The Guardian, People, Page 6, headline after headline, each retelling the same sickening accounts. And the internet? It did what it always does. Half turned the stories into memes, half dissected them with forensic fury. Some fans defended him, unwilling to believe their messiah could fall. Others quietly slipped away. Tattoos still etched in their skin, trying not to feel like branding marks of misplaced devotion. And yet, despite the storm, Jared walked on. He didn't vanish into exile. He didn't retreat to a cabin to reflect. He was still out there, promoting films, prepping albums, smiling on carpets. The machine didn't grind to a halt, which begs the question, how much noise does it take before the system decides it can't drown out the screams? There's a darkness in how power operates. Money buys loyalty. Fame buys protection. And charisma. Charisma buys silence. Fans who had once screamed his name now whispered doubts into the void. But the louder the whispers grew, the more the cult-like structure insulated him. For the diehards, criticism wasn't proof of guilt. It was proof of persecution. If outsiders were attacking Jared, then clearly he must be the chosen one. That's how the logic of devotion warps. None of this was brand new. Rock history is littered with men who blurred lines and paid no consequences. But what makes Jared's case so chilling is the combination of charisma, money, and ritualized fandom. It wasn't just one man with bad behavior. It was a man surrounded by an infrastructure that made him untouchable. Mars Island wasn't just a holiday, it was a fortress. The Echelon weren't just fans, they were his defense shield. So here we are, staring at the iceberg below the waterline. The white robes don't look so pure anymore. The chants sound less like worship and more like noise designed to drown out dissent. And Jared, he still smiles, still poses, still insists it's all just art, just performance, just another misunderstood act. But the women who spoke up don't sound like critics. They sound like survivors. And once you've heard their voices, it's impossible to unhear them. Because behind every cult's glossy facade lies the same truth. The closer you get to the leader, the darker it usually becomes. If the airmail expose was the thunderclap, TikTok was the lightning strike that illuminated just how wide the cracks had spread. Because scandals used to trickle through newspapers, carefully edited, months in the making. Now they explode on social media at 2 a.m., courtesy of a shaky phone camera and a caption that starts with, "So, story time." One viral TikTok in particular hit the Echelon like a bomb. A woman, calm but visibly haunted, laid it all out. Jared had pursued her when she was 17. He knew her age. He knew she was vulnerable. And he played the waiting game, hanging around, keeping her hooked until she turned 18. Only then, she said, did he make his move. As if legality was some magical cleansing fire that turned grooming into romance. She called it what it was: disturbing, manipulative, predatory. The comments flooded in. Some were heartbroken. Fans who'd grown up idolizing Jared, suddenly realizing their posters and tattoos weren't just embarrassing, but tainted. Others were defensive. Die-hard Echelon rushing to discredit her, parroting the cult's favorite line, "You don't know him. You weren't there." Because that's how internet faith works. You either accept the testimony, or you burn the heretic. And Reddit? Oh, Reddit had receipts. Old threads resurfaced, stretching back years, full of anonymous accounts that suddenly didn't sound so far-fetched anymore. posts about underage fans at after parties, stories of Jared zeroing in on the youngest in the room, always with that same uncanny mix of charm and menace. Whisper networks made public. The kind of folklore that circulates for decades, shrugged off as gossip, until someone names dates, names ages, and suddenly the folklore feels like fact. Screenshots, DMs, cryptic posts. The internet became a patchwork quilt of testimony, each square darker than the last. Individually, maybe dismissible. Together, they painted a portrait too consistent to ignore. The same tactics, the same age gaps, the same eerie feeling of being chosen, flattered, and then used. And because the internet is nothing if not a carnival, the memes came too. Photos of Jared in his white Mars Island robes, captioned with cult leader starter pack. Clips of him on red carpets, stitched next to the TikTok testimonies. Jokes about Gucci Jesus, but this time with a sinister undercurrent. The internet laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that leaves a sour taste. The tragedy, and the brilliance if you're Jared, is that in the online circus, attention is attention. A scandal doesn't just stain your name, it cements it in the feed. He trended for weeks. People who hadn't thought about 30 seconds to Mars since 2009 were suddenly Googling his name at 3 in the morning, caught between disbelief and morbid curiosity. And in the twisted logic of celebrity, sometimes outrage sells as well as worship. Meanwhile, the fans who still clung to him doubled down. Every accusation became an attack. Every survivor's story a conspiracy. The cult logic clicked into place. If the outside world is tearing him down, he must be special. Persecution is proof of divinity. It's textbook. And the internet, noisy as it is, made it easy for both sides to dig trenches and hurl hashtags across the void. For those who stepped back, though, the pattern was undeniable. It wasn't just one story, one slip, one regrettable night. It was dozens of overlapping accounts, stretching over decades, stitched together by the connective tissue of a fandom that had accidentally documented its own corruption. And once you hear enough voices, once you see enough patterns, denial starts sounding less like loyalty and more like complicity. The iceberg had cracked wide open. What was once whispered in forums and murmured at after-parties was now carved into the permanent record of the internet. And no amount of robes, yoga retreats, or Oscar speeches could float Jared back to the surface. Because once TikTok has made you a villain, you don't get to be a messiah anymore. The stories weren't vague. They weren't the kind of hazy, he looked at me weird once anecdotes that can be laughed off. They were disturbingly consistent. Different voices, different decades, but the same choreography playing out again and again. It often started the same way. Contact out of nowhere. A message. A phone call. Sometimes a backstage encounter that felt too good to be true. And for a teenage fan, it was too good to be true. Imagine being 16 or 17, obsessed with a band, and suddenly the frontman, the Oscar-winning rock star god hybrid, notices you. Your heart isn't just beating, it's detonating. That kind of attention feels like destiny. Until it doesn't. One woman recalled how the late-night phone calls turned sexual, almost immediately. He knew her age. He didn't care. Another described being invited to a hotel room only to find herself cornered. Jared blocking the door with that same smirk the world had mistaken for charisma. He masturbated in front of her without warning, she said, like she was nothing more than a prop in a performance only he had agreed to. She left shaking, humiliated, and traumatized. Others remembered the way he framed it, always cloaked in intimacy as if he were doing them a favor. You're special. You're not like the others. That line, that poisoned hook, reeled them in again and again. Grooming doesn't announce itself with a neon sign. It whispers flattery until you're too tangled to pull free. The TikTok testimony echoed this almost word for word. 17, contact, flirting. He waited until she turned 18, then crossed the line, as if the tick of a clock turned exploitation into romance. He knew I was a virgin, she said. He waited for that. It wasn't just inappropriate, it was predatory patience, chilling in its calculation. Reddit threads fleshed out more fragments. Stories of Jared at after parties, always scanning the room, always gravitating toward the youngest faces. A girl in high school who suddenly had an all-access pass, then disappeared from the scene with a story she wouldn't repeat. Fans in their 20s who admitted years later that they'd known girls younger than them who had been chosen, and how off it always felt. Different storytellers, different contexts, the same creeping shape. And it wasn't limited to age. Some women described a pattern of coercion, of being pressured into sex they didn't want, of saying no and being ignored. One recounted how he would switch from charm to menace in a blink, how his blue eyes, the same ones directors called magnetic, could turn glacial when you resisted. That sudden drop from worshipped to worthless, as though your only purpose was to fulfill his narrative. When 9 women spoke to Airmail, the language they used was devastating in its clarity, predatory, terrifying, unacceptable, words you don't mistake for hyperbole, words that leave no wiggle room for PR spin. And yet, spin came anyway. The denials were loud. His representatives brushed it all off as lies, exaggerations, coordinated attempts to smear him. But here's the problem with denying patterns. The more identical the accounts, the harder it becomes to dismiss them as coincidence. When different women in different years describe the same scenarios, the phone calls, the hotel rooms, the calculated waiting for birthdays to tick over, you don't get coincidence. You get a pattern. The ugliest part? How preventable it all seemed. The whispers had been there for decades. Journalists joked about it as early as the 2000s. Comedians made asides. Forums traded rumors. Everyone kind of knew, but kind of knowing has never been enough to crack the shield of fame. Jared was beautiful, talented, profitable. And when a man is profitable, Hollywood develops selective hearing. But survivors don't forget. They carry the memory, the humiliation, the sense of being used and discarded. And when the time came to speak, they spoke with a clarity that no meme, no robe, no sunset-lit Mars Island photo could obscure. The pattern was there all along. The world just didn't want to see it. When Airmail dropped their expose, it didn't read like gossip. It read like a court file dressed in serif fonts. 9 women, 9 testimonies, 9 variations of the same nightmare. Predatory. Terrifying. Unacceptable. Words so sharp, you could cut glass with them. And for once, the internet didn't have to embellish. The accounts were horrifying enough on their own. The article painted a picture of patterns, not accidents. Late-night phone calls with sexual overtones. Invitations that felt like opportunities but turned into traps. Hotel rooms where the door shut and Jared revealed his true performance. One woman said he masturbated in front of her without warning. Another described being 17 when he started calling. 18 when the line was crossed, as though legality was just another prop in his act. Airmail didn't sensationalize it. They didn't have to. They laid it out, stark and damning. The dominoes fell quickly. The Guardian picked up the story, their headline blunt and cold. Jared Leto accused of sexual assault and predatory behavior by multiple women. No metaphors, no wiggle room, just the kind of sentence that should have ended a career. Inside, they quoted the testimonies in detail, linking them to decades of rumors that had swirled unchecked. People magazine sanitized it for their middle America audience. Jared Leto denies allegations of predatory behavior as multiple women speak out. Same story, but packaged like it belonged on a coffee table. Serious enough to acknowledge, safe enough not to make you choke on your iced latte. And then came page 6, gleefully blunt as always. Jared Leto accused of preying on underage girls, exposing himself. If The Guardian was the scalpel, page 6 was the sledgehammer. Their write-up leaned on the lurid details, the alleged flashing, the hotel encounters, the age gap grooming. They knew what sold clicks, and subtlety wasn't it. Soon, the internet was a bonfire of screenshots and headlines. Twitter plastered photos of Jared in his Mars Island robes, next to the words predatory and underage. TikTok stitched the testimonies with clips of Jared whispering pseudo-spiritual nonsense on stage. Reddit threads that had sat dormant for years roared back to life, suddenly vindicated. The iceberg wasn't hidden anymore. It was trending. But the real weight of the media frenzy wasn't just in the words. It was in the repetition. Story after story, outlet after outlet, all hammering the same message. There is a pattern here. You could almost feel the ground shifting under the Echelon, each new headline chipping away at the Messiah myth Jared had spent decades building. And yet, this was Hollywood. Headlines can scream, survivors can testify, and the machine will still hum along. The louder the frenzy, the more surreal it became to watch Jared post filtered rehearsal selfies on Instagram, as though none of it was happening. The media had done their part. The iceberg was visible. The question now was whether anyone in Hollywood cared to look. The headlines were deafening. The testimonies were explicit. The word predatory was splashed across every major outlet from London to Los Angeles. And Hollywood? Hollywood adjusted its cufflinks, sipped its champagne, and carried on like the orchestra on the Titanic. Jared Leto should have been radioactive. 9 women speaking out with disturbing detail is not a PR hiccup. It's the kind of story that normally makes sponsors vanish and studios panic. But instead of exile, Jared got another franchise. While survivors were recounting hotel room horrors, Disney was still polishing up Tron. Aries, proudly announcing Jared as its star, as if grooming accusations were just quirky backstory. And Gucci doubled down. Leto was still strutting their campaigns, draped in silk, hair flowing, the embodiment of eccentric luxury. Maybe that's the cruel irony. The same Messiah aesthetic that made Mars Island look like a cult was exactly what fashion wanted. Scandal wasn't a liability, it was branding. Yes, this is a cult had become a tweet, a meme, and now, apparently, a marketing slogan. There were no cancelled projects, no blacklisting. The Academy didn't revoke his Oscar. Festivals still rolled out carpets for him. At award shows, cameras didn't pan away. They zoomed in. Hollywood didn't silence him, it silenced the women instead. This is how the machine works. Scandal makes headlines. Headlines make clicks. Clicks make names trend. And a trending name is a valuable asset, no matter how stained. The system doesn't care if you trend for brilliance or for allegations, so long as you trend. So Jared kept posting. Instagram selfies in rehearsal spaces, videos of him climbing rocks, artsy black and white portraits with captions like light and shadow, If you only scrolled his feed, you'd think he was just another eccentric artist, untouched by the noise. And that was the point. Curate an alternate reality where none of the ugliness exists. And Hollywood let him. No major studio statement, no award show bans, no sponsors stepping away, just silence. Strategic, suffocating silence. Survivors had spoken, and the industry had essentially replied, "We didn't hear that." But silence is never neutral. Silence protects the powerful. Silence tells every survivor watching that their stories, no matter how raw, can be drowned out by money, style, and a perfect jawline. And maybe that's why the anger grew so sharp among fans who once adored him. The realization that the man they'd worshipped could be accused of such things was painful enough. But to watch Hollywood shrug it off, that was betrayal on a different scale. It proved what many had feared all along, that the cult of Jared wasn't just fan-made, it was industry-approved. So while the women's words ricocheted through the internet, Hollywood's silence echoed louder. No boycotts, no reckonings, no reckoning at all. Just Jared, Gucci Jesus, smiling on carpets, untouchable as ever. Because in Hollywood, silence isn't absence. Silence is strategy, and strategy, as always, serves the one with the most to lose. The Echelon had always called itself a family. "We are one," the slogans went. One tribe, one voice, one heartbeat echoing across arenas. But families fracture, families argue, families, when pushed hard enough, tear themselves apart. And when the allegations against Jared erupted, the Echelon went from chanting in unison to screaming at each other across the internet. For some, it was the breaking point. Years of whispers had been easy to ignore, but 9 women with overlapping stories, TikTok confessions with dates and details, that wasn't just rumor anymore. It was proof. And suddenly, tattoos that once felt like proud badges of belonging began to burn like scars. Fans wrote posts about hiding their glyphs under long sleeves, about Googling removal clinics, about realizing that the triangles etched into their skin weren't symbols of family, but reminders of complicity. One woman wrote on Reddit, "I feel like I branded myself with his lies. Every time I look at my wrist, I remember being 19 and thinking he saved me. Now I just feel sick." Others echoed the same regret, the same betrayal, how the man who'd preached connection and love had allegedly used those same words to groom and exploit. But not everyone was ready to let go. For die-hard loyalists, the allegations weren't proof of guilt. They were proof of persecution. "Of course, the media is trying to tear him down," they argued. "He's too powerful, too special, too different. They can't stand someone like him." The same narrative Jared had spun during the EMI lawsuit, us versus them, truth versus the machine, mutated into his defense shield. Every survivor who spoke up was painted as an opportunist, a liar, a jealous outsider trying to tarnish their profit. The result? Civil war. Instagram comment sections turned into battlegrounds. On one side, ex-fans posting black triangles crossed out. Captions reading, "I was Echelon, never again." On the other, diehards flooding those posts with abuse. "Fake fan. You were never one of us. He doesn't need you anyway." Twitter threads unraveled into pile-ons, each accusation answered with hashtags of defense, each survivor's story countered with photo collages of Jared smiling with puppies. It got uglier offline too. At concerts, some fans started whispering doubts in merch lines, only to be shunned, told to leave, accused of poisoning the family. The unity that once made the Echelon intoxicating now turned toxic. Belonging had a new price. Silence. If you questioned Jared, you weren't just disagreeing, you were betraying. And yet, the defections grew. Quiet exits, bitter essays, tattoos hidden under sleeves. Some ex-fans became vocal activists, reposting survivor testimonies, urging others to see the pattern. Others disappeared altogether, ashamed of ever having believed. What had once been a community of belonging now became a community of fracture, with guilt, grief, and rage scattered like broken glass. The most chilling part? Watching the same tools that had bound the Echelon together now tear them apart. The symbols, the slogans, the identity of being Echelon, all weaponized against each other. Former brothers and sisters in arms suddenly speaking in absolutes. Traitor, fake, blind sheep, liar. The one family had split into two sects. The faithful, defending Jared with the fervour of zealots, and the disillusioned, trying to claw their way out of the wreckage. And in the middle of it all, Jared himself remained silent, smiling on carpets, floating above the carnage like a messiah watching his church burn but doing nothing to stop the flames. Because maybe that's the cruelest irony. For years, Jared preached unity, but when the storm came, when the family needed guidance, he let them destroy each other while he posed in Gucci. And that's when the Echelon realized something they should have seen all along. Families may forgive, families may fight, but cults? Cults consume their own. When most celebrities face accusations like this, the crisis playbook is predictable. A tearful interview. A carefully worded apology that isn't really an apology. Maybe even the phrase, learning experience sprinkled in for taste. Jared Leto? He didn't bother. His team issued one blanket statement. Categorically false, baseless allegations. And then went back to polishing his image like nothing had happened. No sit down with Oprah, no notes, app confessional. Just a wall of denial. Clean and corporate. The kind of response that doesn't acknowledge pain, only liability. And Jared himself? Silent. Eerily silent. Not the silence of shame, but the curated silence of a man who knows he doesn't have to explain himself. His Instagram stayed business as usual. Moody selfies, rehearsal clips, artsy captions about light and shadow. If you only followed his feed, you'd think he was meditating on mountaintops, not being accused of predation by nearly a dozen women. That silence worked because the cult filled the void for him. The faithful Echelon did the heavy lifting, flooding timelines with defenses, harassing survivors, spinning every headline as proof of persecution. They became his unpaid PR army, working around the clock to bury testimonies under hashtags and photo collages. Jared didn't have to rebut the allegations. His flock did it for him. Meanwhile, the machine around him kept humming. Tron. Ares still pressed forward. A glossy sci-fi franchise too expensive to derail. Gucci still draped him in silk and threw cameras in his face. Every time a brand doubled down on him, it sent the same message. We're not worried. And if they weren't worried, why should fans be? That's how reputation laundering works. Silence at the top, noise from the bottom, and somewhere in the middle, the headlines get drowned out. The irony, of course, is that Jared had spent years cultivating an image of a man who says too much. The cryptic interviews, as the endless metaphors, the pseudo-spiritual mumbling about energy, destiny, higher planes. But when confronted with actual accusations that demanded words, he suddenly became a monk of denial. No reflections, no admissions, just an Oscar-winning mannequin letting his Gucci robes do the talking. It was damage control by inertia. Say nothing, wait it out, keep working, and disturbingly, it worked. Hollywood's silence gave him cover. Fan devotion gave him insulation. And the endless churn of the internet gave him camouflage, because scandals don't stay fresh forever. They get buried under the next disaster, the next meme, the next trending villain. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't erase the record. It only delays the reckoning. And for every fan who doubled down in his defense, another walked away in disgust. Their tattoos hidden, their playlist deleted, their once beloved symbols turned into scars. Jared never addressed that fracture, never reached out to the broken family he'd built. Why would he? To him, the cult was still intact, because enough remained to sing, to buy, to defend. Damage control didn't mean healing, it meant survival. And in that sense, Jared didn't just survive the storm, he floated above it, serene as ever, while everyone else drowned. Because silence isn't absence, it's strategy. And Jared Leto played it like an encore. The survivors told their stories. They spoke about late night calls, hotel room horror shows, being cornered by a man twice their age who the world insisted on calling beautiful. And for that courage, what did they get? A mix of internet applause, internet abuse, and the surreal experience of watching their alleged abuser still posing for Gucci campaigns as if nothing had happened. Healing is hard enough. Healing while your trauma is trending on Instagram is a whole new sport. Then there were the ex-fans. Once Echelon, now excommunicated. Sometimes by choice, sometimes by force. For years, they'd carried triangles on their wrists and arrows on their ribs, convinced those symbols meant family. Suddenly those tattoos looked less like pride and more like branding irons from a cult you weren't sure you'd ever fully left. One woman posted a photo of her forearm, glyph blurred out with concealer. Caption: thought about getting it lasered off, but part of me thinks I deserve to see it every day. A reminder not to worship men who wear eyeliner like armor. Irony burns deeper than lasers sometimes. Others leaned into gallows humor. Reddit threads popped up titled Tattoo Regret Support Group, where ex-fans compared removal costs and swapped jokes like, maybe I'll just turn the triangle into a pizza slice and call it dinner. The only thing sharper than betrayal is the humor you use to mask it. But not everyone laughed. Some ex-fans admitted the allegations had detonated their sense of self. That band was my life. Those people were my family. Now it all feels poisoned. Imagine realizing the man you defended online at 2 a.m. with hashtags and death threats might actually be the predator strangers warned you about. It's like waking up from a dream and finding out you weren't asleep. You were just drugged. The survivors, meanwhile, kept speaking. Some went on podcasts. Some stayed anonymous. Some disappeared again, unwilling to keep reliving the story while being attacked by strangers with Mars glyphs in their profile pictures. The split was brutal. Half the internet called them brave. The other half called them liars. Welcome to justice in the age of hashtags. And Jared, silent as a monk. While women described trauma in detail, he was somewhere else entirely, maybe climbing rocks, maybe picking fabrics for his next red carpet robe. His silence forced the Echelon into a grotesque roleplay. Fans became his defense attorneys, survivors became his prosecution, and Twitter turned into the courtroom nobody asked for. The irony? For years, Jared had promised his fans transcendence, a family, a higher purpose. And in a way, he delivered, just not the way anyone wanted. Survivors and ex-fans are now bound together, not by love of music, but by the slow burn of betrayal, and the kind of regret you don't wash off with soap. And still, the cult endures. Still, Somewhere, fans are chanting, buying, defending. Because if you laser off a tattoo, you can erase the symbol. But erasing the feeling, the belonging, the nights you swore you were part of something holy, that takes longer. Sometimes forever. So yes, survivors spoke, ex-fans confessed, tattoos were lasered, playlists deleted, old posters quietly recycled at 3 a.m. And Jared? He smiled on another red carpet, the robe a little whiter, the silence a little louder. Because in the end, cults don't vanish when the truth comes out. They just leave scars. Sometimes in memory, sometimes in ink. So where does this leave us? On the surface, Jared Leto is still the man in the robe, the Oscar winner, the Gucci muse, the rock star preaching unity from the stage. He floats above it all, silent, untouchable, curated. But below the surface, in the shadows carved out by survivors' voices, by ex-fans' regret, by headlines that won't quite go away, the iceberg tells another story. We've heard women describe predatory behavior in chillingly consistent detail. We've seen TikToks go viral, Reddit threads resurrected, exposés published, 9 testimonies, then dozens more whispers. A pattern that doesn't vanish just because Gucci wants a shiny new ad campaign. You don't need to be a judge to recognize smoke. And where there's this much smoke, it's hard to pretend there isn't fire. Does that mean Jared is guilty? That's not for us to declare. But is he suspicious? Is the pattern disturbing? Is the silence around him deafening? Absolutely. You don't need a courtroom to see when something stinks. And the survivors, their stories matter. They spoke up in a world designed to ignore them. In an industry that has perfected the art of selective hearing. They deserve to be heard, not drowned out by hashtags and robes. Taking them seriously doesn't mean discarding due process. It means recognizing humanity. It means saying, I believe you when you say you were hurt, and I see the system that let it happen. As for the fans, the echelon fractured. Some walked away, ashamed of their tattoos, angry at their own blind devotion. Others doubled down, defending Jared to the bitter end, as if loyalty could overwrite testimony. Both sides reveal the same uncomfortable truth. When you build a fandom on faith instead of music, betrayal hits like religion turned sour. And Hollywood, they failed, predictably. They chose silence. They chose profits. They let an Oscar and a jawline outweigh testimonies of women who deserved better. That silence is its own verdict, not on guilt or innocence, but on what the industry values. So yes, Jared Leto remains free, smiling, draped in silk. But the iceberg is visible now. The white robes don't look so pure anymore. The chants sound hollow. The symbols carved into skin have turned into scars. And if this whole story has taught us anything, it's that cults don't end when the music fades. They end when the silence breaks. And that sleepless rabble is the Jared Leto iceberg. From shiny beginnings to cult robes, from courtroom propaganda to island retreats, from whispered rumors to testimonies carved into headlines. A story that proves once again, charisma can sell anything, even silence. Now, confession time. My mum, the actual mum behind this very voice, admitted she had a crush on Jared when she was a teenager. Posters on the wall, the whole thing. So let's be real for a second. Who else had a little Jared phase? Hand on heart. Did you ever swoon over the cheekbones? Or did you smell the cult energy from the start? Drop it in the comments. I want honesty. Don't leave me and my mum hanging here. And while you're at it, don't forget to like this video if you made it all the way down the iceberg, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into celebrity madness. Because trust me, there are always more icebergs to map. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to the Jared Leto Iceberg Explained for Sleep. Good night. Don't dream of robes,